can say. Welcome everyone to this session sponsored by the Marxist Education Project. We're very happy to present our good friend Jason W. Moore, to whom many of you don't need an introduction, but I'm going to do one anyway, quickly. Jason is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University. He's professor of sociology there. His books include Capitalism and the Web of Life, which we have had two study groups on here at the MEP, Anthropocene or Capitalocene, and a great, little more popular version of his work with Raj Patel, A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. His books and essays have been translated into over 20 languages and recognized with numerous academic awards, and his main purpose in his work is to coordinate the World Ecology Research Network, which is encompassing scholars and activists working on these topics in many parts of the world. So Jason's going to talk for about 45 or 50 minutes. I told him to just take as much time as he wanted, really, to outline his ideas for us, and then we'll have a conversation with Jason for the rest of the time. So, Jason, you take it away.
All right. Thanks so much, Fred. I promise this will be shorter than history will absolve me. All right. So let's begin by thinking about the recurrent arguments about climate change as an existential threat. And we are told that we are living through end times. The clock is running out. The climate crisis brings the apocalypse. So here's Roger Hallam, Extinction Rebellion's co-founder, talking to the BBC in the summer of 2019. He says, "I am talking about the slaughter, the death, the starvation of 6 billion people this century. That's what the science predicts." And I just want us to keep that last little bit in our head, the science. This is different from saying the work of scientists says X, Y, and Z. It is a claim about the centrality of good science. So Hallam's statement, of course, is totally unoriginal. We've heard this kind of thing ad nauseum repeatedly since Paul and Ann Ehrlich first published The Population Bomb in 1968. And of course, as Betsy Hartman and others have pointed out, there's a longer history to this apocalyptic imaginary in the United States in particular. It's been recycled ever since the population bomb. Its roots run very deep, as I just suggested. And Americans love the apocalypse as few others in the modern world, perhaps because the British and then the Americans have brought end times to so many peoples in the history of capitalism. There's a kind of repressed unconscious when we say, oh, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. There's a kind of repressed unconscious because capitalism has done precisely that, brought the end of the world to so many peoples in its 5-century history. And so one or another version of this end of the world thesis has been a staple of environmentalism as we've known it since 1968. And I'll foreground here that environmental justice movements, working class environmentalisms, are the counter tendency, not the exception, but the counter tendency to this mainstream environmentalism. And in that year, the Ehrlichs delivered this arresting view of the decade to come. They wrote in The Population Bomb, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. We are, the Ehrlichs argued, in a state of emergency. Sound familiar? Authoritarian measures, they said, including compulsory abortions and forced sterilization, are necessary. This authoritarian vision of emergency politics was reinforced later that year by the eugenicist Garrett Hardin of Tragedy of the Commons fame. Coercive measures, Hardin insisted, and the Ehrlichs agreed, must be taken to prevent an otherwise inevitable crisis. Hardin and the Ehrlichs were not shy about the class implications of this argument. Anti-immigrant politics were among its leading expressions. Indeed, the Ehrlichs in The Golden Door about a decade later said immigrants are, in fact, even worse for the environmental crisis than the native residents, so-called, of the United States. And so in an intellectual move perfectly consonant with the neoliberal turn, the mobility of labor, in their view, was to be restricted. As for capital mobility, that apparently was beyond the remit of emergency politics, then as now. Work and working class environmental problems were at best incidental to the new environmentalism. At worst, workers were part of the problem. Now, the continuities between 1968 environmentalism and today's environmentalism are very striking. Ideas of going beyond politics, of apocalyptic warnings, coupled with calls for incremental reform, of listening to the science, of an eternal conflict between man and nature, fixed, in the words of the Ehrlichs, by billions of years of evolution. These unify a half century of this new environmentalism, what I will call, after Peter de Verne, the environmentalism of the rich. At all turns, these threads have been woven with an ideological material that says, whatever you do, don't name the system. Of course, there have always been dissenters and exceptions, as I mentioned, environmental justice movements even before we had the term. But these have been no match for the sprawling eco-industrial complex of government ministries, think tanks, academic programs, foundation-financed NGOs, and green political parties. Even the governing metaphors are largely unchanged. Yesterday's spaceship Earth is, with only modest shifts, today's popular Anthropocene, the age of man, reformulating the limits to growth and the disruption of life support systems in terms that would be readily grasped by participants in the first Earth Day in April 1970. We'll come back to that soon enough. There are, of course, differences, but I would say in form rather than substance. Although the Ehrlichs still cling to an unabashed populationism, new themes today predominate. In highly reified form, so there are socialist and dialectical arguments for each of these that are really the counter tendencies, but in their dominant expressions, economic growth and consumption are typically favored over the older imperial and ethnocentric populationism. But in their dominant form, again, these are in the main neo-Malthusian stalking horses. Growth and consumption are separated from their class dynamics, from militarism, and from the endless accumulation of capital. Now here we can make sense of it within the long arc of Malthusian thought and its long cycle going back to the late 18th century, this long cycle of Malthusian moments, which is only superficially about population and the Ehrlichs' too many people. It is principally about removing questions of human-initiated power and profit from the history of humans in the web of life. Poverty, inequality, well, these can be explained in terms of natural law and the lack of moral restraint by peasants and workers, or decidedly unvirtuous consumption today by whomever. And it's worth noting that this neo-Malthusianism is not limited to environmentalism. Indeed, it underpinned the American New Right's demonization of the black working class in the 1980s, of babies having babies, even while it repudiated mainstream environmentalism. In this mindset, war, poverty, inequality all flow from some version of natural law, not from capitalism's relations of class, capital, and empire. In the 1970s, the root cause, we were told, was overpopulation. Today, it's growth and overconsumption. Well, I would like to go back to this period of the late 1960s and recall one of the simplest but also greatest slogans. That is, the issue is not the issue. Climate crisis, the issue is not the issue. We want to ask, what are the webs of connection of as I like to say, between the climate class divide, climate patriarchy, and climate apartheid? So at the time when the Ehrlichs population bomb was published, it was the subject and would continue to be subject to absolutely lavish and uncritical media attention for years and years and years. But the year that they published the population bomb is also the last year of Martin Luther King's life. And when he turned against the war in Vietnam publicly on April 4th, 1967 at Riverside Church, He did so in that famous speech. I'm sure most of us in this audience are quite familiar with it, Beyond Vietnam. And so what I want to say here is that beyond was everything. And when we think about the climate crisis and climate justice, we need to think at every turn about going beyond climate justice. King, of course, was breaking with the liberal establishment, which saw the war as an aberration, as a mistake, rather than as a fundamental outcome of American capitalism and its war machine. The problem for King was not merely the American war in Vietnam, nor was the problem limited to American militarism as such, which had made it, in his words, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The issue, he said, was not the issue. In a synthesis that joined classical Marxism, New Left radicalism, and the Black communist tradition of Du Bois, James, Jones, and others, King formulated in that speech the first of several cuts at what he would call the triple evils thesis. He said, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, by which he meant class exploitation, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Nor did King stop there. Told to shut up and stay in his lane by liberals, he responded acidly, for those who are telling me to keep my mouth shut, I can't do that. I'm against segregation at lunch counters, and I'm not going to segregate my moral concerns. In a series of speeches delivered the year before his death, indeed precisely 1 year to the day he was killed after the Riverside speech, he argued for a revolutionary critique that was also a revolutionary strategy. In his final address to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in the late summer of 1967, he shared the parable of Jesus and Nicodemus. And in this parable, Nicodemus comes to Jesus and I quote from King, wanted to know what he could do to be saved. Jesus didn't get bogged down in the kind of isolated approach of what he shouldn't do. Jesus didn't say, stop lying, stop cheating, stop gambling, stop committing adultery. He didn't say any of that. Quote, he said something altogether different, Jesus to Nicodemus, because Jesus realized something basic, that if a man will lie, he will steal, and if a man will steal, he will kill. So instead of just getting bogged down in one thing, Jesus looked at him and said, Nicodemus, you must be born again. The issue is not the issue. Now, at this moment, and over the next few years, many of the new environmentalists would come to say something that sounded similar, but was very, very different. They would emphasize holism, connectivity, harmony, even love, as King talks about a revolution in values. But they would not name the system. And those who did, like Barry Commoner, Bookchin, and others, never gained much popular traction. King, who had from his days in seminary believed that capitalism has outlived its usefulness, that's a quote, was not afraid to name the system, or he was afraid, but he did it anyway, and nor was he afraid to name the specific mechanisms of capitalist power. The parable he shared with the Southern Christian Leadership Council focused on the need to cultivate a revolutionary imagination. The problems were not segregated. They could not be fixed one at a time. The whole society, he said, must be born again. It required seeing, in his words, the problem of racism, the problem of exploitation, and the problem of war as all tied together. These are the triple evils that are interrelated. And I think this was nothing short of an argument for a triple alliance, for working class justice, an end to America's forever wars, and the abolition of the color line. It threatened a very radical coalition, indeed, of the civil rights, labor, student, and anti-war movements, not to be taken lightly. So today's environmentalism owes everything to what happened in the years immediately following King's speech at Riverside Church. And as we know, King was murdered on April 4th, 1968, almost certainly with the collusion of the national security state, a point I won't get into, but deserves underlining. But let us recall the situation in the United States by summer of 1968. Every year between 1964 and 1968, witnessed significant working class insurrections, the so-called race riots, in major American cities. King's 1967 Riverside speech was followed by another long, hot summer with more than 150 so-called riots. That fall, during the October anti-war demonstration in Washington, D.C., William Yarborough, who was Assistant Chief of Staff for Army Intelligence, looked at the demonstration and wrote, "The empire was coming apart at the seams." In his view, should social unrest radicalize and spread, there were too few reliable units at home to maintain order and too few reliable units in Vietnam to prosecute the war. At the same time, the New Left had deepened the critique of the knowledge factory initiated by Mario Savio and the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. And this should be deeply relevant to the climate justice movement, but we hear not a single word about the climate academic industrial complex. So in a radical shift by the mid-60s, New Left radicals were outlining, with all sorts of problems, but outlining a fresh analysis of the American working class transformed through the post-war massive expansion of its white-collar ranks. The danger was that for capital, the danger was that New Left radicalism would sink its roots deeply into the demographic bastion of post-war liberalism, the professionals, or what sometimes we call the professional managerial class. Now, not a class, but definitely a cultural formation. And we can get into the nuances of that in our discussion. But competition for these PMC voters would shape the entirety of the American neoliberal era, unifying Reagan, Clinton, Obama, Bush as decades of political life. Well, environmentalism, it turns out, this new environmentalism after 1968 came to the rescue of an American ruling class that was beset by a legitimation crisis. At least in cultural terms, it was greater than that of the Great Depression, even though its socialist politics were not as developed. One or another version of the environmental imaginary that took shape between 1968 and 1974, this was population bomb, Malthusianism, spaceship Earth, focused on the iconic Earthrise and blue marble photographs, the insistence on virtuous civic behavior as a meaningful politics, the ideas of natural limits. All of these had been around for a while, decades, if not much, much longer. As an imaginary, but also as a concrete practice of modern imperialism and world class formation, its origins reach back indeed to the dawn of capitalism in the century after 1492. But in this talk, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I want to look rather at the emergence of a geocultural order at the end of the 18th century that would be carried forth by today's environmentalism of the rich in very, very powerful ways. And yes, it has to do with Malthus, but maybe with some wrinkles that you haven't encountered before. And well, let's see. So Thomas Malthus's first essay appears in 1798. That's an important moment because it really caps off the greatest quarter century of social protest, anti-capitalist revolt that capitalism had ever seen. And I won't go into this at the moment, but I just want to foreground that this was also the last intensively cold stretch of the Little Ice Age following the explosion of the Loki Fissure volcano in Iceland in 1783. Well, just keep this in mind, that climate actually factors in very interesting ways to the ways that we think about the climate crisis and to the ways that we think about climate justice and the separation, the firewall between so-called society and so-called nature. Well, the popular Anthropocene, today's wide-ranging man and nature conversation, is in fact a grandchild or a great-grandchild of the Malthusian imaginary as it formed in the late 18th century. And neo-Malthusianism today is widely understood as about population, and that's always part of it, but it's fundamentally an effort to explain social inequality, not through exploitation and enclosure, but through natural law. And indeed, when we think of neoclassical economics, that's really fundamentally a scientific and natural law way of seeing the world. So when Larry Summers told the International Monetary Fund at a Bangkok meeting in 1991 that the laws of engineering, the laws of economics are like the laws of engineering, one set works everywhere. We're getting a sense of how this force of good science and bourgeois naturalism has really shaped the dominant imaginary of man and nature, and the idea that those contradictions alleged between man and nature can be moderated, navigated, and above all managed by the experts, always unspoken, of course, in the name of capital. And so for Malthus, this was a moment of unprecedented social revolt. The English countryside was practically ungovernable as peasants, as semi-peasants, semi-workers asserted a right to subsistence. There was a proto-socialist movement that was quite robust in London. The Irish Revolt in 1798, of course, there's the Haitian and French revolutions that are unfolding. This is a moment of profound peasant and worker revolt in 1798. Well, a funny thing happens if we go down the rabbit hole of looking at the long ideological cycle, the long recurrence of Malthusian and neo-Malthusian ideas in the history of capitalism since then. It is basically this. They recur every time there is an upsurge in labor unrest, upsurge in imperialism, upsurge in immigration. And so it's no coincidence that we have the first neo-Malthusian moment after Malthus himself in the late 19th century, with the new imperialism and eugenics. So eugenics is, again, an effort to use good science in an uppercase G, uppercase S kind of way, science as ideology, in order to explain hierarchy, inequality, and so on and so forth in an era of massive labor unrest, the scramble for Africa, and all that went with it. And so this is very, very crucial to keep in mind as we try to make sense of the different permutations of Malthusianism, which will not necessarily need to be anchored on the idea of too many people. Indeed, we can see the business press sometimes in a bit of a frenzy, fretting over the end of the long population boom. And so we want to become very, very sophisticated about understanding ruling class efforts to install a kind of managerial, technocratic, good science approach to managing the problems that are generated by class war, essentially, and the endless accumulation of capital. Well, our third Malthusian moment, which is still very much with us, crystallized, of course, in the years around 1968. And historians have a lot of rather fanciful stories about the birth of this 1968-1970 Earth Day environmentalism, none of which are particularly coherent. There was an oil spill in Santa Barbara, the Cuyahoga fire, a river fire outside of Cleveland, iconic photographs like Earthrise and then Blue Marble, or simply Americans became more affluent and therefore started to care more about the environment. I'm not convinced that any of those explanations are really particularly compelling. And we need an explanation for what the formation of this new environmentalism and environmentalism of the rich did. One of the things that I like to point out, citing the great radical muckraker James Ridgway, in a wonderful book called The Politics of Ecology that has largely been forgotten, is he said this new environmentalism in its dominant expression was essentially an ideology cooked up by scientists and a political minoritarian strategy that was waged by lawyers in the courts. Now, again, is that a bit of a broad brush? Probably, but there's something very, very insightful about that comment. And so what we want to get a sense of is the emergence of modern environmentalism, which was really seized upon and moved forward by very establishment forces, not just neo-Malthusians in the Republican and Democratic parties, figures like Gaylord Nelson, who was actually quite good on the war, but also the massive media complex, which did a media blitz like no other. Fred and Steve and maybe some of our older comrades can remember the flurry of media attention to this new crisis between 68 and 71 was boggling. Paul Ehrlich appeared on The Tonight Show when The Tonight Show was actually watched by tens of millions of Americans every night. He appeared on The Tonight Show 3 times in as many months before the first Earth Day in April 1970. And what I want to foreground here is that this build-up to the first Earth Day, which is generally regarded as the kind of birthday of modern environmentalism, was in fact enmeshed in ruling class efforts to split apart a kind of liberal wing of the student population and liberal young professional managerial class types from New Left radicalism. And the rubber hit the road in April 1970. So the Earth Day infrastructure mobilized about 20 million people to turn out for a series of events, most of which were quite banal. And most of which had some creativity, like at Logan Airport in Boston, activists staged a die-in protest against supersonic transport like the Concorde, etc. But the New York Times said it was really more a holiday like Mother's Day than anything resembling an active, strong political movement. A week later, to the day, so Earth Day 1970 is April 22nd. On April 29th, Nixon gives the order to South Vietnamese and American units to launch the invasion of Cambodia. And what we saw, as we know, dramatized by the Kent State and Jackson State killings, was 4.5 million people, overwhelmingly students, shut down universities. National Guards are called out 22 times, killing students in Mississippi and Ohio. And the Earth Day infrastructure did absolutely nothing. A few days after that, David Brower and some of his environmentalist luminaries wrote a letter saying, oh, this is a terrible thing. The invasion of Cambodia shouldn't happen. The Sierra Club eventually condemned the use of Agent Orange and Agent Blue in the Vietnam War, but not the war itself. And if some of you are thinking, well, maybe they just weren't aware of ecocide in Vietnam, that's absolutely not true. Indeed, central to SDS's politics, especially in their famous incidents of their mobilization against Dow Chemical, which manufactured Agent Orange at the University of Wisconsin, the critique of ecocide had been brewing for at least 5 years before the first Earth Day. It was such a major issue that Howard Zinn, yes, that Howard Zinn, wrote a great pamphlet called Dow, as in Dow Chemical, Thou Shalt Not Kill. And this was a really fundamental point of the New Left's mobilization, not just against the Vietnam War, but against what they came to call the military-industrial academic complex. By the way, that phrase was coined by William Fulbright. So that gives you a sense of how much the radical critique had begun to creep into the minds even of establishment figures. And this is what's missing from the climate justice dialogue, which has really gotten into bed with the professional managerial class and its discourse of managing the problem of repent, the end is near catastrophism, the assertion of emergency politics, which invariably favors not more democratization, but more authoritarianism, often invoking technocratic and scientific norms. And so we want to keep all of this in our minds as we struggle to make sense of socialist strategy in the climate crisis and begin to understand what to do and how to, with claims about good science and technocratic management that are now very much deeply embraced. This is the politics, the anti-politics, if you will, of planetary managerialism, something that I've written quite a bit about. And so if we want to make sense of that, we also need to understand that good science was a fundamental, as an ideological construct, and scientism after Jürgen Habermas, but we can leave Habermas as a discussion for another day. But simply, the invocation of science in ideological ways has been central to imperial rule for a very long time. And in some ways, its lineages go all the way back to the invention of the civilizing project in another era of climate crisis in the 15 and 1600s. But for now, we can just understand that after 1945, the American reconstruction of planetary capitalism very much depended on what Habermas famously called later the scientization of politics on a world scale. And the basic idea was straight out of the Malthusian and Neo-Malthusian playbook. It was to convert social contradictions into managerial problems that would be administered by experts, by scientists and bureaucrats. And this thread of technocracy, there was actually a movement in the US in the 1930s called the technocracy movement, has been with us for a very, very long time. So before we talked about the PMC, we had Burrell and Means talking about a transformation of capitalism under the rule of enlightened managers. And in this era after 1945, good science really entered into a new ideological stage. And the historian Paracelsus really gives us a nice summary of what was going on. He talks about how science became a critical three-pronged weapon for waging the moral equivalent of war. The moral equivalent of war. We want to keep that in mind as we think about the climate crisis and about the forces that are shaping it. First, Seltzer writes, in so-called man's endless struggle against nature, technical know-how tipped the balance in favor of humanity. Second, scientific truth was derived from universal laws of nature and therefore transcended political ideology, right? Listen to the science. This is not ideology, this is science. Finally, science revealed in this new imperial cosmology, science revealed the unity and diversity of nature that made the interdependence of nations inevitable. This was later codified by Spaceship Earth, seized upon immediately by Secretary of State Adlai Stevenson, who delivered a speech to that effect in the last political address before his death in 1965. And in Seltzer's words, because natural phenomena such as river basins, ore deposits, migratory routes, the flows of the web of life, in essence, paid no heed to national boundaries, there was an implicit scientific rationale for American imperialism to govern those global biological flows. And that's very much in a nutshell, long before people started to debate Kyoto and the COP now up to 27 protocols. There's this long history of how imperialism and science fit together, and the arguments are always, well, we need to manage growth so that the planet doesn't destroy itself. And it's not that we don't need some kind of socialist management of these issues, it's that the planetary managerialism is about reducing these questions to managerialism and science and technique. So we don't often remember this, but the origins of scientific management in the labor process associated with Frederick Winslow Taylor and the pioneering work of Harry Braverman as a mode of critique, actually that scientific management had its origins in forest management. And there's an even longer history of that, but especially in American forest management associated with figures like Gifford Pinchot. So very, very deep in the American mindset of the environmental problem is a managerial sensibility. Nor should we stop there. When we think of limits to growth, and by the way, I think limits to growth says some very, very useful things. But when we look at limits to growth, the model they used, the Meadows and their team used, was Jay Forrester's World 3 model, which was cooked up at MIT's Sloan School of Management. And so we want to get a sense of the intellectual lineages of how mainstream environmentalism sees the web of life like a boss, like a manager. And I think a lot of times, because eco-socialists haven't been willing to go after good science with an uppercase G and S as an ideological formation, they've missed out that everything, if you know anything about what I usually talk about, it's something called Cartesian dualism. And that's after the French philosopher Descartes saying, well, I think, therefore I am. There's a substance called thinking, and there's a substance called doing. Well, what I want to underline here is that that's a managerial philosophy. What is it that the boss and the manager wants to do? They want to collect all the information, collect all the mental work, and then separate that and then assign the physical hand manual work to the workers. So the workers are thinking not at all, and the bosses are doing all the thinking. So there is very deep in the history of capitalism as not just a mode of production, but as a mode of thought, some fundamental sort of ideological operating codes that have to do with management and managerialism that reach very, very far back. But if we want to do a more recent history, really begin to mature with the rise of monopoly capitalism in the late 19th century. And so in all of this, this calls for us to overcome some of the historical shallowness of climate justice thinking by going back and reconstructing the longer history of capitalism, not just as a mode of production and reproduction, not just as a long history of class struggle, those for sure, but to see how those two moments that I just mentioned, the question of class struggle and modes of accumulation, dialectically speaking, two sides of the same coin, are also about a particular mode of thought and a particular ideological machinery that produces what I call these ruling abstractions, of which the most important are those of civilization and savagery, what today we call society and nature. And we cannot formulate a socialist synthesis and a socialist strategy of climate justice if we are continuing to adopt the boss's view of the web of life. We would no more, like as workers, we would never imagine embracing Frederick Winslow Taylor. And yet that is what the environmentalism of the rich has done. And I think because the history of and the critique of the history of capitalism as a mode of thought and the critique of ideology is so weak in eco-socialist circles, we don't often understand even what we're doing, that in adopting these binaries that come out of Descartes and thinking the separation of conception from execution, as Harry Braverman liked to write about, we don't think about the boss's view of the web of life. And so we have a view of the web of life that doesn't treat the biotariat, if you will, as a comrade in arms with the proletariat and with the femitariat. And the danger is then that we adopt a certain kind of holism, but a holism of the rich that reproduces some of the real political problems of American environmentalism and now climate justice movements. So in making sense of these questions, I think that we can begin to look back at Martin Luther King, and I'm going to turn back to him in just a moment. But for me, what really jumped out at me in sharing the story about the critique of Vietnam, of beyond Vietnam, that militarism has to be situated within a dynamic of class exploitation and racism as a complete dynamic, we also need to look at what happened to environmentalism and its holism of the rich as it, from the first Earth Day, as it essentially jettisoned the critique of imperialism and militarism and war. And there's a longer version of the story, and if you're curious, I'm happy to unpack some of it in the question and answer. But essentially what we saw from the failure of the Earth Day infrastructure to do anything about the anti-war mobilization a week later around the invasion of Cambodia, what we saw after that was an ongoing complicity at the national level of Big Green and imperialism. And of course, there were local groups that were did extraordinary work that were willing to make these connections, that did make these connections between ecocide and imperialism and social justice and so on and so forth. The American left in this period was very, very slow to do so. And we can also talk about why that might be so. But then as we saw the Carter 1978 rearmament, the launching of the Second Cold War, environmentalism was nowhere to be found in terms of the big green national organizations. And indeed, they moved steadily to the right again and again and again. So much so that they were nowhere to be found in the first mobilization against the first Iraq War in 1991. And then, as Naomi Klein and Mark Dowie and others have reported, were actively complicit in ensuring the Clintonian passage of North American free trade and the socio-ecological hellscapes that followed from that. So we want to get in our mindset that there's been this disjuncture of climate and environmental issues and the critique of empire. We really want to zero in on this. And one funny thing, funny, tragic, you have to laugh or cry thing I discovered as I started to unpack this at one level, curious disjuncture between environmentalism and anti-war politics. But then the more you get into it, the more you begin to see the functions of the environmentalism of the rich for neoliberalism, is that right at the moment where Anthropocene, Age of Man, begins to take over and run, just spread like wildfire across academic circles, and then taken up by The Guardian, taken up by the Economist, spreading throughout the popular culture. This era, since 1999, Anthropocene was coined somewhere around the year 2000. This era, since 1999, has, according to the Tufts University Military Intervention Project, witnessed over 1/3 of all of America's foreign military interventions in all of its history. Over 500 military interventions in its history, more than 1/3 have occurred since 1991. So when we look at that, we have to go, why, when we look at the mainstream, but even the eco-socialist discussions of the climate crisis, and I'll include myself in these discussions over the past decade, why is it that we have been unwilling to link the sort of new militarization of American unipolar hegemony and the climate crisis? If we can't put those things together, we should just pack up our bags and go home and stop pretending that we're interested in doing something about the climate crisis. And so here I think we can go back to the moment of Martin Luther King and the crisis of 1968, and we can begin to see how the issue is not the issue. That indeed we can begin to understand that we don't need a workerist approach, although we do need a class-centered approach. We don't need an anti-war approach that's separated from the issues of class and environment. We don't need an environmentalist approach. We need one that is willing to grasp what Marx calls a rich totality of many determinations, which can just become an easy excuse to say, well, it's all connected, and then not connected. No, I think we need to connect it. I think that we need to be able to make sense of what's unfolding before our eyes. And I would say the shortest possible version of this argument is that what we are seeing in terms of the nexus of the drive to war, of a kind of ultra-hegemonic or ultra-imperialist drive on the part of American unipolarity, of this incessant drive to police the world and to discipline the rest of the world in the interests of war, is also wrapped up with the crisis of capitalism and the climate crisis. So how do we begin to put those two moments together? What is it that we need to begin to see? And so, as King implicitly said, the issue is not the issue. These triple evils that he was talking about, racism, militarism, class exploitation, are interrelated. That just as Vietnam was a symptom of a deeper pathology that extended well beyond the war itself, the climate crisis runs far beyond questions of atmospheric carbonization, of economic growth and consumption, and increasingly volatile weather. Now, I would say when we're thinking about socialism, we want to go beyond what's become the vogue, what's become very fashionable on the left, which is to construct a laundry list of problems. It's not wrong to construct laundry lists, or it's not wrong to construct grocery lists, but everything doesn't connect to everything equally. And so for King, I would say adding up the factors was not sufficient. Militarism, racism, exploitation, there was a strategic relation between these different moments. So I would say we must carry forth a message of a concretely interrelated climate crisis, one that reveals how capitalism is not an economic system as such. It's not a social system. It is a way of organizing the relations of power, profit, and life around this very peculiar crystallization of social wealth, capital. Capitalism is, in this sense, a world ecology, an interconnected whole in which we can start to talk about the age of capital, the Capitalocene, instead of the Anthropocene. And this allows us, I think, to directly confront another reference to 1970 that is, in some ways, really run through environmentalist sustainability ever since. And this was from Walt Kelly's famous Pogo cartoon, maybe the most famous and widely read cartoon of the 50s and 60s for sure, where this is where we get the expression of "we have met the enemy and he is us," as Pogo gazes upon a forest that is strewn with trash and just, messy and dirty and polluted. It says, "We have met the enemy and he is us." Well, no, indeed. We need to go back to Paul Potter's famous speech, "Name the System," in which he didn't actually name the system, and we can get into that as well. But we need to name the system, and we need to name the system in a way that is suitably dialectical, that is, that runs a guiding thread that is coherent around class and power and ideology, always within the web of life, that understands that the proletariat stands on the shoulders of the unpaid work of humans and the rest of nature, of what I've called the femitariat and biotariat. We need to understand that the climate trinity, the capitalogenic trinity, not anthropogenic made by humans, but capitalogenic trinity of the climate class divide, patriarchy, and apartheid, are part of a dialectical whole in which each moment is irreducible to the others, each moment is necessary to the others. We need to embrace a dialectical Marxism that understands the great strength of the dialectical imagination is that it can connect what seems to be disconnected, that dialectics flows through variation, not in spite of it, and to resist the formalism that has really made a huge comeback in recent years. And many of you know that there are all these polemics floating around by formalist Marxists like Bellamy Foster and Huber and Malm and other folks. And the funny thing is, I agree with most of them. I just don't think that's the whole picture. I don't think that I have the whole answer. I think that there's a collective process going on and a collective movement that is indeed willing to understand the climate crisis as Marx's rich totality of many determinations. And just on that note, I would go back to like one of King's last speeches, which is the Christmas sermon. It's not on the main a very political speech, but the Christmas sermon in 1967, when he talks about how the whole society must be reinvented as if, and I quote, "all life is interrelated, as if we are," and I quote again, "all are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied into a single garment of destiny." This is the web of life version of the argument "injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It is an invocation of the labor slogan, "an injury to one is an injury to all." And our task is to see how do we need to reimagine those fundamental bedrock principles of solidarity within the web of life. I think then we can begin to move beyond climate justice. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I would say applause is in order. I hope you're all applauding. Okay, we can throw the conversation open at this point, and please just, if you have something to say, either type the word "stack" in the meeting chat window, and we'll put you on the speaker stack, or you can raise your hand using the Zoom icon and the reactions button at the bottom of your screen, or you can just kind of wave at me, and I will recognize you. So. Any initial thoughts, comments, questions, objections? Steve Knight, go ahead.
Well, thanks, Jason. As always with your talks, you've given us, I think, a lot to think about. I would, by the way, just draw everyone's attention to that article from Jason's website, Our Capitalogenic World, Climate Crises, Class Politics, and the Civilizing Project. I was just reading it the past few days, and if you want to really chew over a lot of the ideas Jason mentioned today in a little more detail, that's a great place to start. Wouldn't you say, Jason?
Thanks. Thanks for the recommendation. And your kind words mean a lot.
I also, by the way, I don't want to pull us too far off topic, but our eco-socialist group at the Marxist Ed Project this fall, one of the books we're doing is Climate Change is Class War by Matthew Huber. And there are a couple of places in that book where he takes you on quite pointedly. You may be aware of this already, but I mean, I can summarize them if you're not aware of it. But I just wondered if you know about what he said that's kind of critical of you in places, and if you had a response to it.
One move that he does, and correct me if my reading is wrong, is he says, well, Moore is an underproductionist. And he ends up, and like all the critics, he ends up evading what I see as really fundamental to moving beyond climate justice, which is the critique of the fetishization of webs of life into nature, which has been practically, in very practical terms, an absolutely bloody abstraction in the history of capitalism. And for these Marxist formalists, they want to pretend as if they can proceed by without a critique of ideology. And also there's a disjuncture, and I'll be very polite when I say a disjuncture. And one of the fundamental elements of the Marxist critique of ideology is that we need to look at our own conceptual categories and trace their relationships to the dominant ideas of our times. And this comes out in the German ideology and elsewhere. And so for some reason, these critics like Huber, who says, by the way, many, many useful things that I largely agree with, but has fallen prey, I think, to an academic point scoring and Marxist sectarian approach, which is a shame.
Yeah, he also thinks that you don't take into account Marxist theory of rent in your analysis of cheap nature.
Yeah,
Sure.
But if only we had a theory of rent. But then they always say that, and then they never actually put their finger on a difference that it would make. It becomes an exegetical point, like you were unfaithful to Marx and Capital 3. Well, you know, point me to the place where the interpretation then looks different, which none of them want to do.
Okay.
This is one of the problems of not just eco-socialist thought, but the climate movement. There's what I've called a flight from history. And it turns out we really need to pay attention to the history of how climate and class and empire all fit together, not just in the history of capitalism, but going all the way back to the crisis of feudalism, to the crisis of the Roman West, for a very specific reason. It's not because in some abstract sense you all need to understand what happened in the 5th century. It's because we are as environmental justice advocates, we are continually confronted with the narrative of collapse, which is a neo-Malthusian narrative. And it's absolutely wrong narrative. It's absolutely wrong empirically and historically. The dark ages for ruling classes historically are golden ages for the producing classes and reproducing classes.
Thanks, Jason. Appreciate it.
Who's next? Richard, good. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, first, thank you very much, Jason, for a very exciting and intelligent discussion of a lot of what all of our lives have been focused on throughout much of our lives. I think, like probably everybody here, when I was aware of King's speeches toward the end of his life, that I saw that as, wow, here's the possibility to bring things together in a whole new focus. And of course, even the civil rights movement, you know, joined forces to oppose King. I guess my question to you is, I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on how we bring the people who are subject to these three evils, and let's focus maybe on the civil rights movement and minorities, the black struggles, and so on, to move beyond the desire to be part of the existing system and willing to stop with that. Do you see elements today, do you see people, parts of movements, and so on that are taking sort of the civil rights aspects of this to that deeper level that you're calling for? Let me just start with that as one way.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So we can see this not just across the United States, but across the world. In the United States, we have a long and robust history of working class environmental justice struggles. Now, sometimes in the current vogue, environmental justice is taken to be a race reductionist concept, both by critics and by advocates. But I would say when we look at the 1970s, and this is a point that I've made in various texts, we can look at how environmentalism directly turned against farm workers' struggles, farm workers who were being poisoned, miners who were suffering from black and white lung, the overwhelmingly racialized working classes of Louisiana's Cancer Alley. Then more recently, we could see wave upon wave of struggles, the Southwest Organizing Project in the 90s and the Southwest. Even I would say extending that to housing justice struggles and many sort of more politicized versions of and working class versions of environmental sort of urban gardening and things like that. Urban gardening can be, of course, very, very PMC and elite. But I think that we see many sprouts of a working class environmentalism, even in the United States, and then globally as well. When we saw the great struggle at the North Dakota, the No DAPL struggle there in North Dakota, we saw some of the elements of labor, indigenous, environmentalist student movements coming together. Of course, very short-lived. The basic problem is that, and here I think I would totally agree, emphatically agree with somebody like Huber, that to build a climate justice movement, we have to build a working class movement that involves, but can't be reduced to, a strong labor movement. And I think also I think the ideological struggle is is to try to connect across these firewalls of, the people talk about climate apartheid and pretend like apartheid wasn't a class regime of super exploitation and imperialism. And we have to say, wait a minute, let's go beyond. And I think maybe if we can say it that way, not like some magic speech act will do it. I don't mean like that. But if the spirit of our argument can be one of both and, which is the spirit of dialectics rather than Cartesian thought and either or, then we can begin to make those connections, and to make those connections that insist that urban environments are every bit as much environmental as a forest in a field, that a Starbucks or an Amazon warehouse is every bit a site of socio-ecological struggle as a housing project or an agricultural field or a forest. Then there are possibilities for these conversations, I think. And because we're dealing with 5 centuries of ideological indoctrination. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, we've been sort of hardwired to think in terms of these very fragmented, fetishized man versus nature, nature versus society ways. We need to be willing to be uncomfortable to pursue a connective imagination.
Jack is next on the stack. Go ahead, Jack.
Okay, thanks for your talk. It was extremely enlightening, and as it went on, I changed my mind as to what you were basically saying. And I hope I can ask this question without seeming to fall into the very trap that you've been talking about of separating out the different crises and saying they can be dealt with independently. But to an extent, in order to talk about them, you have to do that at least provisionally.
Right.
And I want to ask you about the climate crisis. When you started out, I honestly thought you were moving in the direction of telling us that the climate crisis is not real. It's an obfuscation invented by establishment scientists. I realized along the way that wasn't what you mean, but I didn't get what you do mean, what you do think of it. should we agree with the predictions, for example, of the Sixth Assessment Report, and recognize that the climate crisis is severe and threatening to civilization? At the same time, of course, that we have to take account of the fact of who is the most impacted by it and who is going to come out ahead profiting from it. But I would like your basic statement of how you see the climate crisis.
No, make no mistake.
Jason, can I piggyback on?
Oh, absolutely. Totally.
I was thinking of some kind of question along the same lines, but I'm thinking in particular of how the climate justice movement or whatever has kind of fallen down in approaching the actual people who are suffering directly from the climate crisis. So the folks in South Florida, the people of Puerto Rico, the Mississippi Valley now, where the entire river system appears to be drying up, the victims of wildfires in California, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a growing, not only is there an awareness, but there's a direct extent to which working people are suffering the consequences of the climate crisis and could be approached and mobilized around issues like that on a serious basis. So.
Well, absolutely, and I think our task as socialists is always to adopt that dialectical sensibility, which is where my own arguments always start, which is both and. Now, that doesn't mean all relations are created equal or all causes are created equal. Not at all. That's another PMC academic fantasy. Well, we're just going to assemble everything and everything's connected to everything, and we don't really actually have to go to Puerto Rico and figure out how to organize, say, struggles to reclaim the energy commons, for instance. I mean, they're being pummeled by a privatized electrical system or utility system now. So you're exactly right, Fred, that how do we build out those connections? I mean, ultimately those are on the ground connections, but I think the trick is to always keep what looks like social and what looks like environmental very close together, because whether you're an organizer or a thinker, you find that in fact there's no firewall between them. There are distinctions, and there are moments that are more about, say, social relations of exploitation, but you can't make sense of the social relations of exploitation and dispossession unless you understand that already those are embedded in and shaped through webs of life. And I'm sorry, I spaced out. Jack, is that who was asking me the question? Okay, perfect. Yes, Jack, you're absolutely right. That I've said this so many years, and not that you should know, but my critics always say, oh, Moore thinks of the climate crisis isn't a real thing. Now, practically everything I've ever written begins with something that recognizes the enormity of the climate crisis. In fact, my Capitalism and the Web of Life, its first citation is to Johann Rockström and the planetary boundaries thesis. Now, I think Rockström himself is a deeply problematic political figure that has been given a free pass. He goes to Davos and the World Economic Forum and gives interviews to the Guardians where he says, well, we only have a few years. We need to get the bankers and executives on board, all of that kind of thing. So yes, indeed, the climate crisis is indeed extraordinarily serious. The IPCC and other models have to assume that capitalism as usual will continue through the climate crisis, which accounts for the extraordinary projections that we see for a century ahead. In my view, capitalism is now a zombie mode of production. It's dead and moving around and quite deadly. That doesn't mean that socialism is on the horizon. Maybe yes, maybe no. But it does mean that what we are seeing now is a movement on the part of the two greatest imperialist blocs, the one centered in China and the one centered in the United States, to head towards a post-capitalist transition towards what Samir Amin used to call a tributary mode of production that would contain many of the elements of capitalism, by the way. And I'll post something on this on my website very soon on imperialism with and without cheap nature. But in any event, we have to look. See, here's the problem. Here's the great weakness of eco-socialist discussions and analyses of the climate crisis. that with very, very few exceptions, they're not willing to look at the actual contradictions for capitalism as a system of accumulation. And let me just give you a salient example, and we can talk more. That Ortiz Bobea and her colleagues published a wonderful piece in the journal Nature Climate Change in 2021. The part of this team is Lobel and Fields, who have been writing about climate's yield suppression effects for most of the past decade. I think their work is really fundamental. I've never found other socialists who are writing about the climate crisis who cite any of this. And basically the finding is this, that the climate crisis is fundamentally suppressing agricultural productivity. They don't understand the implications, but I do, and we do as socialists who have read at least a little bit of the history of capitalism. We understand that it's premised on an agricultural revolution model. Produce more and more food with less and less people. I don't care who it is, if it's Brenner or it's Wallerstein, it's whomever you like to cite on these questions. There's no capitalism without that agricultural revolution model. It gets invented and reinvented across the centuries. It's now over. And it's over for lots of reasons beyond the climate question, by the way. This is how I conclude Capitalism and the Web of Life and other texts. But in the case of purely climate-driven yield suppression effects, there's not going to be another capitalist agricultural revolution. And that means that the whole sort of edifice of capital accumulation, as we've known it, has to change fundamentally. Now, does that mean that there could be another model of political accumulation on the horizon? Certainly, but it would not be this capitalist endless accumulation model. And finally, the critique of apocalypticism and catastrophism is completely separate from the recognition that, of course, the climate crisis, and Fred, your question speaks directly to this, is an actual catastrophe for living, breathing human beings all across the planet. I mean, you have the 8th largest country on the planet, Pakistan, that was a third underwater. And so there's no question that that's a catastrophe. But let me say this. When we look at the history of unfavorable climate changes in world history, they have destabilized ruling classes. This goes all the way back to the Bronze Age crisis in the 12th century BCE. And you can say, oh, this is climate determinist. No, I think it's a climate class conjuncture because climate is related to agriculture. And when the climate changes in very unfavorable ways for ruling classes, that's because the agricultural core, that core mechanism gets broken. That's what we saw in the crisis of feudalism. It's also, by the way, what we saw in the first capitalist-driven climate crisis in the 17th century, which was, it ends with situations like Cromwell's revolution in England, where he finds, oh, I have a communist army outside of London. What am I going to do with these people? And so let's remember that moments of unfavorable climate shift have historically been, yes, moments of great hardship, but also moments of great opportunity, of political possibility for the reproducing classes.
Would you please repeat the name of the author of the paper that you're talking about the agricultural crisis?
Yes, absolutely. Let me see if I can just maybe write in here. I forget. Let's see. And you can go bug me if that does not show up there. Along with Lobel and Fields and company, who have been writing. Oh, I can't do this very well. Sorry. Lobel and I'll write Fields in here too, who I think are part of the team. And nobody wants to cite this because there's this kind of, like, all the critical agrarian studies people refuse to think globally and systemically in terms of the mechanisms of capital accumulation. And we need to do that in a socio-ecological way. This has been part of my disagreement for now the better part of a decade with eco-socialists, because I said eco-socialism opened up the question of the connection between climate and capital, and then continued to use theory and organize their research as if these two were separate. And so, as I was talking about in terms of the drive towards war, we have to understand what's going on in Ukraine as part of the general socio-physical and class climate conjuncture of our times, and we can't make sense of it otherwise.
Nebojsa is next.
Thank you, Jason, for this great lecture. It's very inspiring. I heard your lecture at one conference in Romania. I spent pretty much of my remaining activist energy by subverting this narrative. So local NGOs here in Serbia, which are friends of mine, and when they go with this Anthropocene thing, me as a geologist appearing as authority, I said, no, it's not Anthropocene, it's capitalism. Believe me, and then anyway. So, but I have a problem with I totally understand and agree, but I would just suggest not using in very discourse of yours, just adding in front of each time you refer to science, bourgeois science, because because like there is an incredible parallel with this methodological skipping of the connectivity in research of historical fascism, also contemporary fascism or post-fascism, whatever it is, where in fact all bourgeois science tends to separate this issue from capitalist conditions, and it even made Horkheimer say this, who don't want to speak about capitalism should be silent about fascism. So like there is some, I mean, we cannot, of course, give up science. What you do is science, in fact, but it's not bourgeois science that just turns the blind eye on these connections between the power and propriety in contemporary global society and the problems of that society. Just that, I would just be super and in fact in socialist tradition, I mean whatever it was here in Eastern Europe, we used that term bourgeois science, and like since no one recognized it as a valid to say discursive tool to address certain issue. I just have one example. On the occasion of 150 years of the first issue of Capital, a few years ago, 5 years ago, I visited Hamburg Museum of Labor, and there was this first issue, and next to it was written, "The bourgeois economic science went silent about the book," but bourgeois economic science, not just any economic science. Okay, thank you very much once again.
Comrade, I totally agree that, of course, we are dealing with bourgeois science, imperial science, and that imperial science is always bourgeois science. And one book that I would just share with everyone, I can't recommend it enough, is Richard Lewontin, Kamen and Rose's Not in Our Genes. It's on the surface a critique of genetic determinism, but really it's maybe the most robust popular critique of bourgeois science that we have in the English language. And I'll share with you just the experience that I had as for many years a fellow traveler with John Bellamy Foster, who always told us to celebrate Richard Lewontin and Richard Levins, but never said, oh, read Not in Our Genes and the critique of bourgeois reductionism and bourgeois science. We need that. Your point is so central. Like Nancy Fraser's big critique of me is that I have a critique of science, and therefore that undermines our ability as a socialist to deal with climate change. Even somebody so serious as Nancy Fraser says these things, that I think because it's maybe one of the thought crimes of the neoliberal era to speak of bourgeois science. Simply to say the words.
Okay, any further thoughts, comments, questions, challenges? Steve?
What on the current environmental scene gives you the most hope right now, Jason? Anything you can think of?
That's a good question. I'm sure I'm going to think of I'll tell you, this is just idiosyncratic and where I've gone lately, that where I've turned is to look at labor struggles inside the academy. And then simultaneous with that is to look at least my students, who are overwhelmingly working class students. They're very bright students, and they have, in contrast to who they were 6 or 7 years ago, there's almost an anger at mainstream environmentalism. And there's this sense that this kind of like, they'll say things to me like, I had a professor who told me to monitor my ecological footprint and buy organic when I go to the grocery store. And there's almost like a rage that's underneath, that they just feel offended at the limits of this kind of eco-managerialism in the academy. And I think that in some ways the labor ferment within the academy is one as well as the labor unrest and organizing beyond it. And I have all these items in my Twitter and news feeds of all this movement around the country. There's something dynamic that's going on, and we're to quote Mike Davis, and may he rest in power, after so many historic defeats, we are now looking for the ways to reconnect and reconsolidate a new working class movement that understands the web of life is not auxiliary to our struggles, but is fundamental to it.
Great quote from Mike Davis.
We are, by the way, can I mention at MEP, we're doing a Mike Davis reading group in January and February.
That's what I was about to say. Steve and I.
Oh, sorry.
A Mike Davis reading group. We're gonna do the greatest hits. Most of the environmentally related greatest hits, which there are many.
I mean, I'll share with you that the book that had the biggest impact was Prisoners.
The American Dream, yeah.
Yeah, it was Prisoners of the American Dream, which is still to this day this kind of raw and driving assessment, fearless assessment of American capitalism and the working class. That those are, it's so important to go back and read those, because I think a lot of the greatest sophistication of Marxist analysis from the 60s, 70s, and 80s has really been lost. Like, have you noticed that there are no Marxists who write about the ruling class anymore? I mean, there are, but not many.
Yeah, he's not that great a Marxist, but Doug Henwood is supposed to be writing a book.
Well, Doug is supposedly writing.
He's never published it. He talks about it every year or two, and it never appears.
We're waiting. It's like Godot.
Yeah. Oh, Barbara, go ahead.
I would also maybe add that there are not that many Marxists, full stop, maybe. In comparison, maybe especially to that time. I just wanted to ask, I've been reading about environmentalism for quite a while. I'm an architect, I work in academia, and at some point I began to think that exactly this is not the question, and that the scope is too narrow, especially when I finally got to the issue of the enclosures and Karl Polanyi and all of this link between land expropriation and privatization, and then the growth imperative. And from that point on, within architecture, my field of research switched to social housing. And most of my critics of research projects, etc., don't really get that relationship between environmentalism or climate change or climate rights and social housing. It feels like an awkward relationship, but to me it's quite intuitive, and I think it makes sense. And even in terms of labor rights or social movements, I think like narrowing down the environmental question to just issues that are really linked to pollution or flooding it's just so limiting and so narrow, so specific to certain, it's so hard to build solidarity around that, while actually building it around enclosure and land rights and the right to the means of production, of owning your property or owning it collectively. This is so much more, I think, powerful. And then I get very nostalgic because I read about all of the social housing projects that were part of my discipline all throughout modernism and how all of that has been completely obliterated. There's this very striking number of how in the 70s, 50% of architects in the UK worked for the government, and now it's 0.01%. And how architecture is actually completely subsumed to land valorization, gentrification, which means expropriating the poor. And exactly that mechanism that you explain in your Medata article. I always start my classes with that article, by the way. explaining the kind of the mechanism of eating up the land and the earth, of just settling, consuming, and moving somewhere else, and how that links to, I think, the larger enclosure movement, and also the way that we are brought onto the process of eating up the world as architects, giving stamps of luxury validation onto most of the time things that have zero use value but a lot of exchange value. And so I don't know, I haven't really found anyone connecting these two things in terms of actual social movement struggles. I wondered if you think that makes sense.
It makes perfect
sense. Thank you for your work.
Oh,
it's
well, thank you, Al.
Great,
Oh, what a joy to see. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, thank you for your question. Your assessment, it seems to me, is brilliant and perfectly stated, and really strikes to the heart of this problem, that there's the environment, which has been created as an acceptable academic object of study, often, as you implicitly suggest, for the reproduction of the system, right? We're going to create this object of study, and then we can assign, like now there's environmental architecture, there's environmental literary studies, there's environmental this and that. But of course, we're dealing with habitat, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
and habitat is one of the most intimate socio-ecological questions, and at the core of any socialist vision of climate justice. Mike Davis wrote compellingly about that. And of course, what you're saying, and I have many comrades in design and architecture who are wrestling with these questions, and you may know some of them, but I would be happy to connect you if you can email me. But yes, precisely, we need to look at, for a socialist strategy, the question of housing is going to be fundamental. And so the cities will have to be rebuilt. The electrical and water systems will have to be rebuilt with collective housing. And there are, as you know much better than I have, I do extraordinary proposals for how to do this. And that we'll need to also take seriously the lessons, warts and all, of, say, socialist states and socialist projects to do this. I think of, one of the main forms of architecture that is routinely pilloried, the Khrushchevskas. But the Khrushchevskas provided high-quality housing for hundreds of millions of people in a place when there was in places that were absolutely devastated and were no running water and all sorts of problems. So we need to look at that rich history so that we can begin to see it as, like the housing question is one of the most socio-ecological of all the questions we could have. Yeah. And so we need to struggle against the eco-managerialism of environmental studies to say, no, it's only about the forests and the fields and the habitats of critters or sustainable agriculture or something. No, it's about how do people live? What's the nature of cities? So solidarity, It sounds like it might be a difficult environment, if you will, to work in.
Yeah, I see those videos of the American tent cities, and they look like environmental disasters to me in the most violent sense.
So true.
Well, we have more time if anyone's thinking of saying something.
These are great questions, great interventions.
Okay.
I'll pose a question, though. You might not want to answer it, Jason, because sometimes writers don't want to do that. Are you working on a new book?
Yes, absolutely. The tagline is that moments of climate crisis are moments of political possibility. And that while climate is not everything, but to make sense of anything, you need to understand how climate is connected to, well, everything. And once we begin to do it in that way, we have a much more nuanced and I think hopeful vision of climate justice and of socialist possibility.
Look forward to it.
One more thing.
Sure, Nabasha, go ahead.
Yeah, Jason, you mentioned housing as somehow overarching issue that somehow contains everything, all the other societal and political issues, to say. But I think that without addressing the very core of existence, the production, global production, we will not somehow manage to get to the horizon of let's say, possibility of societal imagination of something different. And experience of ex-socialist countries is important because these huge housing projects, modern cities, everything was some sort of a step forward. Now we can think, what is it now when everything is privatized? But without complete, how to say, I mean, we as a science, we shouldn't give up holism to bourgeois thought, you know, like there is holism, socialist holism. And I think that we have to be aware that now it is possible, first time in entire human history, that there is at least technological possibility for entire global economy to be calculated. So already 7 years ago, there was a possibility to calculate entire Soviet economy. And it was not without reason that that was singled out, because that was a huge problem in Soviet economy, the incapacity to calculate a planned economy. So there is possibility of global planned economy. And then it will be a struggle with so many different positions, because bourgeois individualism is also somehow adopted in many fractions of working class globally. And we discussed the issue of property when it is about housing, private property. This is so interconnected that without clear horizon of different mode of production, global production, we will have hard time even coming up with a language that can open these capacities, these ambitions, etc. I think that there is a writer from Caribbean that wrote Caliban's Reason. You know the book Caliban's Reason. Caliban is a character from Shakespeare's Tempest. Yeah. And like he's presented as a very bad, colonized, uncivilized half slave or something. And then he wrote the book Caliban's Reason, why he has a right to be like that. And his proposal at one of the debates in Brecht's Forum, in fact, was that his conclusion was that we need working class institute of technology, so that the horizon of the development of technology should be totally recaptured and or reoriented in a direction of changing the global production. I mean, it sounds like almost utopianism, but without that, I mean, we are still in Thomas More's shoes on that level.
Yeah, so of course I completely agree that unless we have a socialist strategy for working class democratic control over production and investment decisions, we're not going anywhere. And this is one of my quibbles with many degrowth and New Deal discussions, that unless there's a socialist strategy for getting there, then it's a dead letter from the beginning. Now, Nebojsa, you may know this, but I'll share it anyway, that between 1951 and 1962, there were very serious proposals by Soviet computing scientists, cyberneticists, to transition the whole of the Soviet Union to essentially an electronic payment system for everything. And it had great support, I believe, from Kosygin, who was maybe vice premier at the time. And ultimately, the Soviet Union doesn't go very far in that and other matters because there was too much competition between the major institutional players, in contrast to the United States, which put Jay Forrester in charge and developed a modern computing system. And that's where we get the internet. But yes, absolutely, that I completely agree that we have to talk about democratization of production, and also the forms of technology that are necessary and appropriate to a climate-ravaged world.
Barbara, I believe you had more to say?
Yeah, I have a question. Maybe this is an annoying question, but I'm just curious because I also read John Bellamy Foster quite a bit, and usually along with the related text comes his text on ecological imperialism. And I wanted to ask because I have a feeling that a lot of the critiques that are made of your work, like the Nancy Fraser one you mentioned, etc., they sound very much like critiques to Bruno Latour and this more like, post-humanist approach with the more flat materialism, flat ontology, less Marxist than actually your work is. And I don't find it so hard to reconcile what you write with the monthly review crowd, except that there's differences in maybe a slight shift in one direction or another. But I was just wanted to, I wondered if you agreed with that, because to me, a lot of the critiques that I hear about, I don't know, that sort of critique I hear repeated when I hear it applied to Latour, I tend to agree. And I was
It's
just
a
wondering
bizarre. Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, I wanted to ask basically what his influence was in your work, and if you would agree that maybe you get lumped in some way, or if maybe that's me reading into
Well,
it.
the sectarians do lump me in. I mean, Latour's influence on my work, absolutely zero. And indeed, the first 50 pages of Web of Life, as you know, is a critique of Latourian flat ontology. So the more interesting question is, it has two parts. Why do the sectarians try to attribute figures like Haraway and Latour, who I've never really cited in any meaningful way, and I've criticized repeatedly. In fact, I have a very long essay on Latour that should be coming out over the next year. I see Latour as not only a problematic figure, but towards the end of his life, a very retrograde political figure, as in the calls for a defense of the European homeland. The connection with Haraway, I mean, most recently, this has been done to me in the monthly review zine, where they say, well, Haraway and Moore have the same conception of Capitalocene. And the people who write this apparently have no shame. Like, it's what an embarrassment. Donna Haraway says many, many interesting things, and but she's not really a figure of the left. And she's certainly not somebody who's sympathetic to dialectics and Marxism. So the interesting questions are, why are these figures being attached to me, and then basically smears being made of my work and deliberate obfuscations? And then why is it that so many eco-socialists take that seriously? One great example is like the claim, oh, Moore is a monist, and as you know, Barbara,
right.
It's a term I use one time. It's one time, and it's only because I was saying holism again and again and again and again. And the reason why I was using a relational holism or a dialectical holism, that phrase, is because I took it on board from Paul Burkett, who is, of course, a very close co-thinker of John Bellamy Foster. And it's very, very curious what's going on, that there almost seems to be a willful drive to obscure the actual differences between, say, somebody like Bellamy Foster and me, and then also to deny that arguably, with the exception of some methodological and philosophical differences, but ultimately there's much more common ground between us than there are differences. Exactly.
Well, actually, Latour would be worth criticizing at more length, which is not, I think, done that often.
Just wait for it. Mine will come out, but there's some great critiques from Benjamin Noyes and from Rebecca Lawson, also. But Latour, I see, as a very problematic figure. So what strikes me as deeply embarrassing to some of these figures, like Malum, who goes around the world saying that Moore is a hybridist. I don't know how you can be a hybridist and a monist at the same time. If somebody can explain that to me. But it's frankly embarrassing that he doesn't understand. First of all, I never used the term hybrid, and that I wouldn't, because as a critic of agrarian capitalism, I can't think of any critic of agrarian capitalism who would use that. But then the fact that he can just project that onto me to discredit me it's very strange. It's even more strange that people seem to like say, oh yeah, that's a reasonable criticism. Those aren't our differences. There's this flight from history that's going on in eco-socialist thought. And so I thought Malm was going to come back and say, look, we have to ground our analysis in the class and fossil fuel dynamics of the Industrial Revolution. Moore says the turning point is in 1492. I say it's in 1830. Let me tell you why. That's what I thought was going to happen.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's this flight from history, which, by the way, I just want to say in passing is characteristic of bourgeois thought. So I'm not saying that Malm or Foster are bourgeois thinkers. That is not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that if you want to have a productive disagreement, let's have a disagreement over history, not reproducing the German ideology problem. Remember, Marx and Engels say, well, we're going to throw our phrases against your phrases. They're going to throw their phrases against my phrases. Who the fuck cares is what they're saying. Let's get down to business and talk about history.
Thank you. Very clarifying.
On that note, I don't know whether we can wrap this up at this point or whether anyone else would like to chime in. Several people I know are here and have not spoken, but you're welcome to remain silent too. No problem with that. So otherwise, I will thank Jason once again very much for the talk and the conversation, and thank all of you for joining us for this. And before I go, I want to throw up some information about our next event with Bill Robinson coming up in 2 weeks on Saturday the 19th on global civil war, capitalism post-pandemic. And there's too much text here and it won't paste, so bear with me.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you for such a great set of questions and a fun conversation.